Does anybody here speak Finnish? Does anybody here speak Finnish?
Anyone here?
Because I could use some help with the following song. We have lyrics. I'm going to pass around. There's not enough for everybody. Lyrics for you. You want to sing?
Nope. Oh, you're passing? No. Oh dear, no. Wait, what? The troll. Oh, really?
Okay, wow. Let's go. Tim Wilson. It's not really Finnish. Everyone, Boca, Fenla, Bumariki.
Oh.
What happened to this? Somebody might have pulled the plug. I'll do it myself. You're so lucky, Tim.
I am.
There is another couple minutes of that.
Gone.
Okay.
So it does work. Okay.
I will. Ladies and gentlemen, a man who wants no introduction.
All right. Good morning. Thursday. I think we'll get the slides up at some point. Unless everybody wants to turn around and gather around the screen in the back. So we're going to talk about time series concepts, day 4 of Superweek. I do have 2 kind of not related at all to this topic things that I want to hit on. In the interest of time, I'm just going to hit on the one that I personally is kind of the most important to me, and then I hope I get time to kind of slip in the other one at the end. So before we dive into the main topic of the day, for a lot of you know and were involved in last year when about this time at Superweek, I was beginning to kind of contemplate a trip with my oldest son to travel around parts of Europe for a couple of months this past summer. And this was a great crowd to tap into with sort of tips and ideas. I'm not saying I was planning it. My son was planning it. I was really just a data collection device. So anytime somebody gave me a tip, I would pass it along to him. The last thing I wanted to do was get tips on traveling around Europe from Americans, because I know how that will go, that it's like the one place they went to. You got to go there. It was amazing. So the Superweek community came through in a way that like wildly beyond my best possible dreams. So looking back on where we went, it would have been a fantastic trip. My son is amazing. We had a great time. It would have been great even without the Superweek crowd. It literally was probably 40% enhanced for a number of reasons. And it was the generosity really of this community, the analytics community, the Superweek community in particular. I was looking for tips. Instead, we wound up with like multiple time tour guide hosting at his flat for a wine tasting, extending our stay in Lyon with Simone. Lucas met up with us, went on a hike, we had dinner, then he went and took a business trip, then he came back and met us with us again. So that was amazing. Magic I got to see, he's not here this year, but I've gotten to know him through Superweek. Fosca, turned out she met up with us in Bologna. And all of these, you should be nervous if you are a parent saying, I'm on a trip with my child and I'm going to introduce them to people I know through work. That sounds like the most crappy dad move ever to pull. And My son's girlfriend was with us. She came for 10 days. She stayed for 3 weeks. So Simone and Lucas both got to meet Lucy as well. And I kept coming back into the room after, like, Lucas and I had gone out. He had kept his bike in the flat and was leaving. And I came back and I came around the corner, and it's like they stopped talking. And I was like, what did I miss? And my son kind of sheepishly, he said, Lucy wants to know, how do you know these people again? Because they're so generous, they're so fun, they're so interesting, and I don't think I've got to be in a tiny, tiny percentage of people who get to have an experience like that. Even there were a few people, Robert and Julian, both for parts of France and Croatia, gave some great tips, so they were kind of instrumental as well, even though they both made sure that they were not around when we were actually there, so I didn't get to see them. So that, to me, I mean, I never planned that. When I left Search Discovery, my last day of work, I was talking to my manager. Superweek came up, and she said, I made some comment about going and talking to analysts. She was like, Tim, these are just your people. And I was like, okay, you know me. You're my manager. And you guys really are. So for all of you, if this is your first time, if you've been before, and you're making connections and thinking these are like neat people, is this just like the weirdness of being kind of isolated somewhere? No, we're fantastic people. So thank you, Zoe. I never would have known this sort of thing would have come out of my Superweek connections. It had nothing to do with analytics, but it was amazing. So thank you. So that probably further blew my timing on this session, but I did feel it was important to say. So now on to the exciting topic of time series analysis. So let's kind of think about time. We live it. We are in the moment. We process time. It is so built into what we do that this presentation, in your mind, you have a mental filed away, this should be about 40 minutes. You are at Superweek. You know that Superweek, it's 5 days. We shift units of time very, very smoothly, very, very fluidly. The job that I just left, I was at that job for 5 years. We all can kind of internalize, what does that mean? Almost for everything. I mean, there are some things like Yehoshua's intros, when you say how long do those last, they sort of feel infinite, time stands still. But for the most part, we're very, very comfortable with time. And that actually makes it kind of tricky. As digital analysts, it is almost all of our data has time as this really, really, really key component to it. So we think we just get time. And I remember at some point in my analytics career, I actually realized, oh, wait a minute, there are all these other data sets out there that, yeah, they have timestamps here and there, but time is not as integral to the data as it is when we're looking at behavioral data. So when we talk about time, we think of a line chart. So what is the best practice data visualization recommendation? If you're visualizing time series data, it should be in a line chart, unless there's some specific reason not to have it as such. The thing is, it rarely looks quite like this. We're all thinking like, yeah, if our data was just kind of this flat little noisy thing, it would probably be pretty easy to analyze. So in digital analytics, often, depends on the organization, but I feel like more websites than not have this like weekly cycle, dips on the weekend, good for humanity. They're getting out and staying off the digital world on the weekends. And a lot of times it has a trend to it, and the trends can be much messier than this. It'll go up and down over time, plus we have anomalies, plus we're trying to change the metrics, so we're trying to make the metrics move, so the data gets a lot messier. So if you're starting to think, is this whole presentation going to be a bunch of line charts? Yep, it is. So it goes. So that's the time element. But on the other side, we want to have statistical rigor. And so how do we combine statistics with time? And if we think about the definition of statistics, or a definition of what is kind of statistics or statistical inference, it's fundamentally about trying to make estimates or inferences about a population from a sample. And I think this definition has gotten this industry into a lot of trouble, because we've thought, oh, well, we have the population. When digital came out, for years, and even still, hey, guess what? We're tracking everything. We have every interaction for every user tracked. So we don't need to estimate the population. We have the population. a little commentary about all of the hand-wringing around privacy and how do we hang on to as much data as possible, I think arguably is nested in the fact that that's because we just have a deeply held belief that we have to have all the data. We have to have the population because that's how we do our jobs. And now we're starting to find out that that can be kind of tricky when having all the data causes a lot of problems to try to actually maintain it. So let's think about the population in the context of time. So we experience time all the time. So this is a timeline. We know that there's the past, there's the present, and there's the future. So when we're looking at data that is time series data, what is the population? And if we take the definition of, well, we've been tracking all of that data from the past, so that's our population, right? Maybe, but if we're just looking at the past, then don't we really care about the future? How can we affect the future? So maybe the population, the true population, should actually also include the future. We don't have that data, but that may be the population that we're trying to make inferences about. It may be that from a decision-making perspective, that's the only population we care about. We can't do anything about the past, so we can just use that data, but we really care about the population of the future. I actually don't have the answers to what the population is. It probably is situational. If somebody has look, this is the way to think about population in the context of time series data, please share it with me afterwards, because I've grappled with this for about 4 years now. Regardless of what our population is, the sample, we can't sample from our sample, we can't sample from the future. There is no data existing yet. So what is our sample? Well, our sample is actually a little bit easier because 99% of the time, our sample is some finite point in the past to now. It could be just yesterday, it could be last week, it could be the last month, the last year, but that's our sample. So that's definitely not our population, I don't think. So if we think about a sample to a population, ideally, if we wanted to know for some reason how many Hungarians like broccoli, then if we designed a study and said we're going to do a random sample, we're not going to go ask every Hungarian, but if we went and do a random sample of Hungarians and ask them, then we can use that sample to estimate the population with some degree of uncertainty. But our sample's not a random sample. It's kind of the convenient sample, and it's kind of the best sample that we have. And it's fairly representative. If I said I wanted to use this sample to make inferences, if I took last week's data and I wanted to use that to make an estimate about next week, assuming there's not some major externality or me rolling out a campaign or some other factor, I'd probably be okay. But if I tried to use last week's data to make an estimate for a week that's 3 years from now, we know that that's silly because the farther we go into the future, the more things have changed. So now you're alarmed that I'm just going to kind of navel gaze and try to think big thoughts about time. And I'm kind of done with it for now. But hopefully, if any of that resonates, you're thinking, okay, wait a minute, there is something to this time. There is complexity. And it does mean that if we're using an imperfect sample, we probably need to be really careful with what it is we're actually doing with that data and how we're actually using it. And it's a complicated topic. If you look at advanced degree programs in business analytics or statistics or data science, there is typically an entire course that is required on time series analysis, advanced college level course on time series analysis. It is rarely in the first year of the program. It is kind of an advanced topic. So we clearly can't cover all of that. I'm not actually qualified to cover it, so we're going to hit just a couple of specific topics. The first one is going to be stationarity, which when I pitched this topic to Zoli, I didn't think there was any Matt Gershoff involved in this. When I started developing the content, I thought, yeah, I usually wind up referring to Matt Gershoff, but it's not like a thing that I have to do. Then, son of a bitch, if I didn't start working on the content, and I was like, okay, think back, how did you learn about stationarity and why it matters and where is it important? And I was like, God, it was a conversation with Matt Gershoff. So I don't remember the total specifics. I remember a little part of it where I said, well, I'm trying to do this. And he said, well, yeah, because that time series data is not stationary. And I was like, Matt with his big words again. But I thought I can parse that one out from context. That we think about time, there's kind of movement of time, to the past, to the present, to the future. So the data is kind of moving. So I was like, I got this one. Figured it out from context clues. And I played that back to him, and he was like, no, that's not it. Tried to explain a little bit more. I didn't quite get it. But from future, kind of as tends to happen with Matt, he plants a seed, and then it kind of grows, and you start noticing it. So non-stationarity is a really actually important topic. So kind of this definition, which seems pretty good, a little wordy, but it's a time series where the statistical properties do not depend on the time at which the series was observed. So what does that actually mean? Well, you can actually start recognizing non-stationary data pretty easily. There are 3 characteristics that can break stationarity. We're only going to hit 2 of them. The first is that if it has a varying mean. So what does that mean? It really means the data is trending up or down or up and then down. Because if you think about it, if you just picked an arbitrary window on this data set and calculated the mean, you'd get one mean. And if you picked another arbitrary time period, you get a different mean. They're different. So a varying mean means the data is trending. The other is it can have a varying variance. This is kind of an extreme example, but we've seen this in our data too. And we tend to think like, well, that's a little odd. What's going on with that data? The same idea, if you take one arbitrary time period, have some measure of variance, standard deviation, whatever, and you use the same measure in a different arbitrary time period, then you'll get a different measure. And those varying things, we're starting to use statistical measures, and if they're varying in time series data, that should give us a little cause for alarm, or at least caution, that we need to sort of proceed with caution. So if we go back to this first chart we looked at, this is a stationary time series. If you kind of grab the window at any point, it's going to have roughly the same mean and roughly the same variance. What about our weekly cycle? Is that stationary or non-stationary? And this was, I thought, well, that seems non-stationary because it's clearly varying. But this is actually a stationary time series. Assuming you're picking a large enough arbitrary window, the mean, if it encompasses the same number of kind of weekends and weekdays, the mean is going to stay roughly constant, and the variance, even though there's high variability, it's going to stay roughly the same across different windows. So it's a little tricky, but once you kind of internalize what it means, you can look at a data set. This is why we like to visualize the data and say, do I have a stationary data set? If so, proceed with caution. What do I need to do about that? So with that, my favorite kind of stationarity trick, and I didn't come at this, I didn't learn this because this is a stationarity thing. It was only later after I'd learned first differences and read more about it, I was like, oh, stationarity comes into play with this. And it's pretty cool. Quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with first differences? Okay, this was kind of what I was hoping for. Every hand didn't go up. I did a sample of one last night with Simone Breton, and I felt pretty good. He wrecked my confidence on a later topic, but we'll get to that. So first difference is a really, really simple idea, and it actually deals with stationarity in a way. So if we look at this data set, or these 2 metrics, and this is kind of based on a real example, just simplified, and we've got a marketer has come to us and said, look, we have a measure where we just have a macro measure of social media engagements with our brand, and we also separately in our digital analytics data, we have a measure of orders. And it looks like they're moving together. These look to be correlated. And I know correlation is not causation, but hey, Tim, I just want to run this by the analyst. This seems like an easy one. It's a quick question. Are these correlated? And I look at it and say, they look correlated to me, but if I'm checking correlation, I really sort of prefer a scatter plot. So let me take that data set and make it a scatter plot. Same data, each point is a day. It's the exact same data. And I'm like, yeah, visually, clearly this looks, these are correlated, but I want to play the role of an analyst, so let me quantify it a little bit. Let me go ahead and throw the R-squared on there. And I can explain, like 0.84, that's a pretty strong correlation. It matches the visual. So yeah, they seem like they're correlated, right? And the me, a younger, earlier me, has said yes. And I'm now a little embarrassed. I might have been right, might not have been right. Don't still have those data sets. Because the me of now would say, well, maybe. Or I would say, guess what? DALL-E 2 does not handle specific word prompts into a cloud. So the closest I could get to maybe was may. So I was pretty excited that in the first day or two, there were people pulling ChatGPT into their sessions. Actually, the first one that it happened in, I was sitting next to John Lovett. I was like, yeah, how many people are going to use ChatGPT in their presentations? He's like, well, I am. I was like, oh, okay. But I was like, haha, no one's using DALL-E 2. And then Vlad and Lucas and David kind of wrecked that for me yesterday. I think they did a better job of it. But this is the conference where we're going to use generative AI in our presentations. So that maybe, why maybe? It seemed like it's such a clear story. But if they're actually correlated, then it doesn't just mean, it's a subtle difference. It does just mean when one is high, the other one is likely to be high, and when one is low, the other is likely to be low. If they're correlated, then it could also be implying that when one moves up, the other one moves up. So when one goes up, the other one goes up. When one goes down, the other one goes down. That should happen in general, not perfectly. We're not expecting perfect correlation. So we could look at that as well. And that's where first differences comes in. It's actually looking at the change from point to point. And we're only going to have one table that we're going to look at. But calculating first differences is super, super easy. You might have already figured out how the math works. We basically, just to show one example, we're going to take the 21st to the 22nd. We have two values. To calculate the first difference for December 22nd, we just subtract the value of December 21st from December 22nd. That is the difference. That is the change that occurred to get me to this point. So simple spreadsheet math. Like so simple, you're like, is that it? Yep, that's it. But let's look at what happened to that data with that change. So if we go back, and we're just looking at orders, we're going to come back and add the other metric in here in a second. But this was just our orders data that was trending upward. If we plot that second column, the first difference column, it looks like this. The scale is a lot smaller, but now we have actually a stationary data set. So this is not that doing first differences will always make your data that's non-stationary stationary. It is not first differences is the only way to make non-stationary data stationary, but that's kind of what's happening. And if you look really closely and said, what's the mean of that stationary data set, it's going to be a little bit above 0 because the data is trending upwards. So now I have a stationary data set. And if I go back to my data, I can calculate that first difference for both metrics. And this is really trying to say, are they actually moving together? Not just when one's high is the other one high. So if instead I make a scatter plot with those columns, the first differences, everybody sort of think, what do you think that scatter plot is going to look like? It looks like this, which now, not so sure that it was correlated. I can throw an R squared on this, and it's actually 0. That will not always happen. That's the reason you do this operation. I have gone through and done first differences, and I still wind up with an R squared that says, yeah, there is some relationship here. This is an example, though, where the data really looked visually to me like they were correlated. But then when I applied this, I had to say, well, wait a minute. Let me think about what's really happening with that data. And it depends on what you're expecting as kind of the response. And I know we're using kind of lagging. You might use a lag function to do this for first differences. This is not about like lagging indicators and leading indicators. You have to think a little bit harder about it, that's not what this is. You can do second differences, so you can kind of skip a level, or third differences, but first differences is kind of the core of what we usually work with. And the interpretation is that they're both moving with time, but they're not really moving with each other in this scenario. If you're familiar with, it's been around for over a decade, Tyler Vigen's spurious correlations site, the ice cream and drownings. Once you kind of internalize this idea, you can start looking at those correlations, and a lot of them, not all of them by any means, but a lot of them you'd say, aha, a first difference would actually undo the apparent correlation of this. And then you look at other ones and say, oh, first differences, I think this would still have some correlation. So what's going on with that spurious correlation? I think it's pretty cool. Like, once I discovered it, we almost kind of went to a client and gave them a completely wrong answer when our head of data science was like, you might want to run first differences on that. And we said, I'll get back to you as soon as I Google first differences. No, he actually explained to us how to do it. And I was like, well, that's super easy. I feel horrible that we didn't know about that. But then you start poking around. It is kind of, you have to be kind of deep into much, much more complicated topics when it talks about differencing. But it's pretty easy to check and can kind of make you think about the time piece of the data. So now we're going to shift gears. This is where Simone gave me a little bit of a heart palpitation last night. So I'm racked with self-doubt on this because I actually talked about this next topic 5 years ago. And I thought, look, I saw the show of hands of who the first-time attendees were. It's like half the people. And literally, I will be the only person who remembers anything that I talked about 5 years ago. And Simone was like, didn't you talk about that 5 years ago? I'm like, son of a... So there are at least two of us. So I apologize if you remember this. But we're going to talk about decomposition. Fun fact, DALL-E 2 does have some content moderation built into it. If you try a prompt that includes the word gruesome, it will say, nope, I don't know what you're up to, buddy, but I am not going to generate that. So I went through an alarming number of prompts to try to get decomposing puppies and then realized that maybe something with flowers in it was probably okay. So we're not talking about decomposing organic beings. Of course, we're talking about time series decomposition, which is just a really, really cool idea. And I hope there are people here in the room who are like, yeah, I know what that is. But it's really another way to kind of think about time and have the intuition of our brain match up with what we're actually seeing in the data and use statistical concepts. So if we take this data series and we say, I would like to describe that with some basic statistics. Can you give me summary numbers about this? So I could calculate the mean, and that doesn't feel right because why is it lower below the mean at one point and higher above the mean later? It's like, can't it just like tilt the mean? That's what we want to do. If we could just tilt that line, we'd be in better shape. And that's the right intuition. That's the right instinct. We're going to talk about how we actually do that. And then we said, well, and how variable is the data? And I may do the same thing and say, well, let me just calculate, I don't know, standard deviation, do plus or minus 1 standard deviation, plus or minus 2 standard deviations. And that feels weird because the fact is, if I asked anyone in this room, gave you just the data set and said, can you project out for another couple of weeks what you think the data is going to look like? You think, well, I would know to draw a couple more kind of oscillating values. So this doesn't feel right that this is the representation, the summary of what's going on with this data. And time series decomposition kind of takes that intuition that that's not right and says, how do we actually formalize what we're doing with it? So what we do with decomposing a time series, and there are multiple different techniques and there are little subtle ways to tweak it here and there, but they all fundamentally say you take the time series and you break it down into 3 buckets. So we're going to take our time series, that's the same time series, that's our original time series. The first thing we're going to do is say this has that weekly cycle to it. And in statistical terms, that's a form of seasonality, it's a weekly season. So we say let's pick out and figure out what recurring 7 values are most capturing that data. So this looks kind of similar, but it's actually the exact same 7 values. Every 7th value is exactly the same on this series, and that's our seasonal component. We take that, we subtract it out from the original, and we have the data that's left. And for that data that's left, we say, let's kind of apply some smoothing to it. And there are different techniques. You can do just a moving average. You can do exponential smoothing. There are various techniques for smoothing it. And you get what's called the trend component. And this is as simple as just going up, but that means even if the data was going up and then kind of down and then up, this smoothing, it's still called trend. So it's not trend like a straight line trend necessarily. In this case, it is. And we take those values and subtract them out from our original. And what we have left is what's left, formally called random or noise or error, depending on how you're looking at it. So now if I take any given day and I add up those 3 bottom components, it's going to total what's in my top chart. Why would we do that? Well, conceptually, I've started thinking about those top two components as being kind of like a smarter mean. It's basically the mean because it's kind of a set way that we're describing the data, just in more of kind of a lightly modeled form as opposed to a single number, which means that it's the what's left component is really our variance. So if we go back to our original chart, and remember when we said just a mean with some basic calculation of standard deviation, it felt wrong. But if we take that time series decomposition and we take those first two components, seasonality and trend, and overlay those, yeah, this is a pretty clean, a pretty stable data set. So our mean runs pretty close to being right on top of the actual values. And if I said, what's the actual variability around it? Well, I take the what's left component and do a calculation of variability and make that as kind of my little bands. And now I've got something that feels much, much better. So you can imagine if I'm trying to find anomalies or if I'm trying to model the data and do some sort of forecast, this gives me a much, much tighter thing to work with than just saying, yeah, we think that next week we estimate just whatever the overall average is. I can get to a much, much more detailed level. So I love me some time series decomposition. Show of hands, how many people totally remember me specifically talking through this topic 5 years ago? Simone, 2, 3, 4, okay. That's good. Okay, I don't feel too bad. Everybody who raised their hand, I don't mind wasting your time. You were due for a refresher. Okay, it's a really, really powerful tool. And any statistical sort of platform can do that. Time series decomposition, super common, lots of resources out there to kind of understand the what and the how of it. This is going to be a little bit of a leap, but I'm going to say that idea of trying to kind of get a tighter model of time series data, it's kind of let's take that one step farther with a different technique. So we're going to introduce the B word, Bayesian. Which I am not equipped to fully talk about Bayesian things. I know two things about when you're doing things Bayesian. You're supposed to say, priors. And then the other thing you're supposed to say, Bayesian, so there's no p-value. Unfortunately, we're going to talk about a p-value in this, and I can't fully understand what's going on. But we're going to talk about Bayesian structural time series, which are also pretty cool, not remotely new, but I've started thinking of them as kind of time series decomposition turned up to 11. If you guys weren't hanging with Johnny 5 yesterday, I don't know that This Is Spinal Tap reference is going to get you, but that is a kick-ass Dolly 2 representation of Christopher Guest right there. And for the 4 of you who actually get that, you're old. But this has also been around for a while. As a matter of fact, Mark Edmondson, back in 7 years ago, stood up GA Effect. And it was a shiny app that you could log into your Universal Analytics, and it would apply this exact technique to your data. And I saw this, and I was like, that looks fancy. I don't understand it. And then over time, slowly, I started to understand what was going on. Really, it's only been in the last year that I've actually been using this technique, not this tool. I suspect he's not updating it for GA4, but it's been around for a good long while, and it's actually pretty, really powerful. And what it's doing is it is best used to kind of estimate the impact of an intervention. So we're going to use the term intervention, which starts to sound a little bit like statistical speak, but an intervention is just, I did something. I redesigned the landing page. I rolled out a campaign. I did something with the intention of actually impacting a metric. I added a consent banner to the form. That's a very specific example of where we used it, and I want to estimate the impact of it. So where does this happen? The most common, in my experience, is when the product team or the marketer says, we want to know the impact of this thing, and we didn't run it as an experiment. Maybe because it didn't occur to them, maybe because they didn't want to, maybe because it just wasn't worth the investment, but they say, I still want to know what the impact of this thing was. So can't you just do a pre-post analysis? I will claim that most marketers, when they ask, hey, can you do a pre-post analysis? In their head, this is what the data looks like. It was super stable, and then we did this thing, and there was a big step function. And you can just pick a week or two before, a week or two after, do the average, and you're all set. We're analysts, so we know, well, get over yourself. The intervention was probably a lot smaller, but I could still work with that. but I hate to tell you, but the data's a lot noisier. So it's going to vary based on when I pick. Do I pick 1 week or 2 week? I could pick all of these. I could pick 1 week and 2 weeks and 1 month before and after and then average them together. Like, oh, this gets messy. It's, again, our brain and our intuition being on the right track, but we can actually use specific tools and techniques for doing this. Oh, shoot, I forgot. We also have the little cyclicality to it. It starts getting kind of hard to say, if I looked at that without that vertical line saying when the intervention was, would I really have suspected that there had been an intervention? And this is where kind of modeling the data ahead of time can actually be kind of useful to pull into this. So that's what causal impact is, the R package that uses, you didn't think I was going to get through this without talking about R. Causal impact is a package that uses Bayesian structural time series to kind of compare the historical data to model a counterfactual, and then you compare the result to the counterfactual. So we'll run through this pretty quickly. We start with the, Robert, you're supposed to be waving at me. I'm on the wrong side of the stage right now. So, okay, back over here. I'm also getting my steps in. Robert's sitting still, so that step challenge is, I'm catching up with him. So we start with our data. We just ignore everything after the intervention. And we use this Bayesian structural time series technique, which kind of runs simulations. If this looks very similar to the time series decomposition mean, conceptually, intuitively it is. It's taking a completely different approach, but it is building a model and saying, how can I model what that data looks like? And oh, I've got a model, so bonus, I also get a measure of the variability. How good, how tight is that model? So that's great. Now I can take that and I can extend that out into the future. So I'm modeling the future. I'm saying, what do I think would have happened if we hadn't had the intervention? So I'm estimating the counterfactual. Then I go back and take my actual data and overlay it, and we can kind of look at it and say, well, yeah, the time those data points are falling outside of that confidence band, it's happening more than I would expect. So I think I am seeing an effect, but it turns out this is tough. It's matching our intuition that it's not a huge effect necessarily, but we can start to actually think about what that effect is. There's another way to look at it, which, if that's a little bit hard to interpret, what if instead we took that mean, our estimated line, instead of let's make that a baseline and then just compare that to the difference, like what the actual values were. And this one's a tougher one to kind of get to, but it makes sense when you think about it a little bit. So that's the same dotted line. I've just made it 0, and then I've just looked at the difference between the dotted line and the orange line, and it looks like this. And so now I can start to say, okay, yeah, it does look like I'm seeing the intervention. I'm seeing the effect of the intervention. And then, for reasons I don't fully understand, we typically take that confidence and we band and we put it around the actual instead of around the model. I don't fully understand why. I don't think it actually matters. But you start to get a sense. It's the same thing, telling you the story of how much above and kind of with what confidence. Then we actually do get measures that actually quantify, like, what does that actually look like? Well, we get this thing called a posterior tail probability P. Shit, it was Bayesian. And there are discussion threads saying, I thought Bayesian didn't have p-values. And kind of my understanding of the response is like, well, it's not really a p-value, but it kind of is a p-value, and kind of interpret it like a p-value. So if it's a really small number and you have that, yeah, this Bayesian structural time series is saying that, yeah, it does look like we're seeing an effect in this longitudinal data analysis. And it can even get to both telling you this is kind of the effect that we're estimating, and here's kind of the confidence around that. So you can go back to the marketer and say, we think kind of this is the effect, plus or minus this. And they may say, well, that seems like a really wide range. And then you say, well, let me talk to you about Bayesian structural time series. No, don't do that. But we do want marketers and business users to start having some intuition around uncertainty and the scale of uncertainty. So I think that's actually a good thing. There's actually more with this technique. So we could do all of that really with time series decomposition with some other techniques. Even this next thing we could do with that. So there are lots of techniques for taking this basic approach. But we can actually introduce covariates. And covariates can be really, really useful very quickly. there's sort of two characteristics of a covariate in this context that are really important. The first is that the covariate, the one or more covariates we use, have a stable relationship with the metric of interest, meaning they have some like valid correlation, basically, of some amount. And the second, which is really critical, that we do not expect the covariate to be impacted by the intervention. As an example, we redesign the PDP, and we expect that to improve the conversion rate. So really, we expect that to increase the number of orders. Great. We do this whole thing, and we get an estimate of, we redesigned it, what did it look like? We can make the model tighter, potentially, because we know our business. Sometimes traffic is up here, sometimes it's down here, sometimes it goes back up. So if we just look at orders, we're not accounting for the fact that the raw volume of traffic to the website. So we could use sessions as a covariate and say, does that tighten up the model? Does that make the model better and that confidence band narrower? Because we wouldn't expect a redesign of the PDP to impact the actual volume of traffic to the website. And this doesn't have to stay in our digital analytics data. We've done this where we've looked at like external factors of like what is demand, what are new home starts, and I want to use that as a covariate when looking at the impact of SEO on a website that builds new homes. So it's another like really cool thing. You can go way down in the weeds with this, and you got to be careful. It's not a silver bullet. It's not that's always the tendency with the new technique. That becomes our hammer and everything looks like a nail. And you can get into trouble if you apply this and say, I found something that looks amazing. It's like, well, maybe you didn't do it quite right. It's not the silver bullet to solve all time series issues. So, quick review. We talked about population. Maybe had you think about what is the population, but hopefully I convinced you that the sample has some weaknesses to it, and that means we need to proceed with caution when we're working with the sample. We talked about stationarity, which constant mean, constant variance, and constant covariance, but we didn't really talk about that. We went through first differences, which is don't jump to correlations. There's some clever wordplay right there. And went through time series decomposition, which was a review for 5 people, but maybe it was, well, I'm sure others of you knew about it. You just hadn't heard about it from me. And then we talked about Bayesian structural time series there. So really the big conclusion is time's important, but it's also hard. And I'm hoping you came out of this saying, I think I have a slightly deeper understanding of time, and I might actually want to try a technique or two. I'm going to give one recommendation, and this deck, there's the short URL. This book, Forecasting Principles, actually has enormous, it's a free, you can get it free online as an ebook, so it's a great resource, goes into ARIMA, goes much deeper into differencing. I don't think it actually covers Bayesian structural time series, but it's a great book. I'd love to connect with you as well. I have a podcast. I'm watching, where's Rick? Where's Simo, Juliana, all you other, you just keep it clean on your podcast because we want to stay the top. We can own that explicit analytics podcast. Do whatever you want, but I'm watching you. So that's all I have. I have one more thing. Can I have 2 minutes to talk about that? And then you can come back and say we don't have time for questions? Sure. You've been so well behaved. I'm speechless. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so one other thing, if many of you were thinking, gee, Tim usually winds up like talking about R a lot. So what the hell happened? Like he quit his job and now he's no longer about R. Well, here's kind of just the fun little background. This entire presentation was developed in R, so there is code. So that was me like sneaking it in. You've been watching R the whole time. So it uses Quarto, which is a relatively new sort of tool within that, and then it's hooking into Reveal.js. The second thing is all of the images were DALL-E 2. It was actually useful. I encourage people to try an actual specific project. It took more prompts to get less satisfactory results than I wanted. It's not what I expected was going to happen, but it was a former coworker named Jesse Reynolds who kind of suggested, have you thought about trying to use generative AI images? Because Tim, you like to use photos and images in your presentations. So I did. I tried it. And then finally, this is really subtle, and it's actually, I'm now realizing you can't quite see it on the screen, but there's a whole background. If you go to the website that came from my little daily diversion thing on Twitter, which is kind of this image randomization thing. So I actually snuck in something from last year's Golden Punch card into the presentation as well. So none of those are particularly important, but thought I'd share them. With that, thank you very much.
Clap your hands, make some noise. And we are unfortunately
Out of time?
Out of time.
Okay.
We're going to do two quick questions because everyone. Oh, sorry. It's going to be Raphael. He's sitting here. He called me out even before I got him. So it's going to be 1 and 2. But can you give 1 or 2 brief examples of, in the business context, a description of the interpretability and the actionability of the way that you saw those numbers? For example, with the first one, you saw 2 lines going up with social media engagement. Seems to be, well, when people are speaking about your brand or et cetera, like it relates that they're maybe making it to the website, buying. Like, how would you describe that now to the business?
So for the first
interpretability
differences,
and
the best
action?
way we came up with was saying, if we control for time. And we try to use that explanation. And that was a very real example where they were looking at their field reps activity and website activity and saying they were related during COVID kind of chaos. And we came back and said, yeah, we don't think you're seeing that. We think both of these are being impacted by things that are happening with COVID, but they're not actually relating to each other because the marketer thought that, oh, it is because sales reps aren't showing up, the customer is going to the website. And we basically said, if we control for time, that's not actually true. It did take a little bit more of their attention, but we managed to explain it. And I would say on the Bayesian time series stuff with clients that rolled out a consent management platform and their visits dropped, and they said, can we quantify that? It's not that hard to actually explain, we're going to model this historical stuff and compare it to it. They also said, can we do that permanently? Can we just model this forever going forward? And we said, no, that's what we want to talk about, the divergence of time.
Okay. Raphael.
Hi. So you spoke about causal impact, the R package.
Yes.
Can you explain a bit more about how you use it?
It's actually
In
really,
general?
I mean, if you Google causal impact R package, Google has a really nice set of, Vlad's like, but it's shit or no? It's not so good? It's not so good? It's good? Okay. Literally, you feed in a time series data and you tell it where the pre and where the post intervention was, and it spits out visuals that, I mean, it looks a little different. I mean, they're basically that represented, not on a presentation. It's even got a little thing where you can say, give me a summary report. It writes you like a 3-paragraph thing that explains it. And if you want covariates, you just include those in additional columns.
So it does all the hard work for you.
Yeah, which scares me a little bit since I don't fully understand what it's doing, and that's generally, that's me. I'm running with scissors. I think I'm holding them properly, but I still feel like I'm running with scissors. And I've done things where I'm like, that doesn't make any sense at all, and have figured out I've kind of done something a little bit wrong. Because you tell it the cyclicality. There are lots of little settings you can put in, and you do need to be kind of careful.
So Tim will be spending his lunch in the lobby, and people can meet Tim in the lobby during lunch and ask a bunch of questions. We appreciate you taking time out of your lunch to meet with the people here at Superweek. Thank you so much for being a good sport, Tim. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and make some noise for Tim Wilson! Move!